The year was 1872, and the sun over Dry Creek burned like judgment itself. Heat rolled through the dusty main street, drawing sweat from men and misery from beasts. The air smelled of smoke, sweat, and the metallic tang of iron horseshoes striking packed earth. Every window shutter was half closed against the glare, yet every eye in town found its way to commotion in front of Harlan Dade's general store. A woman was on her knees in the dust, the hem of her calico dress torn, her face streaked with dirt and tears. Eliza Ward clutched a small cloth bundle to her chest, as if it were life itself. Around her, men with sun-beaten faces and whiskey-thick voices murmured and spat, forming a circle of judgment. Above her, the sheriff stood tall, boots polished, badge glinting. Caught her red-handed, Sheriff Dade said, voice low and even, the kind that carried authority like a whip. Took bread and medicine without pay. Call that survival if you like. I call it theft. Eliza tried to speak, but her throat gave out before the words did. She swallowed hard and forced her voice past the dryness. Please, my boy's sick. I told your clerk I'd pay when he's better. He said no credit. I didn't mean... Didn't mean? Dade repeated, turning his head slowly, letting the word roll. You mean you didn't mean to steal, or you didn't mean to get caught? Laughter rippled through the crowd. A woman on the boardwalk clutched her child closer, whispering something that made the boy's eyes widen. Eliza's knees sank deeper into the dirt. She untied the bundle. Inside lay half a loaf of bread and a small glass bottle of laudanum, its cork still sealed. I only wanted... Wanting don't excuse taking. Dade interrupted. And law's the law in Dry Creek. We keep order here. Order. That was Dade's favorite word. He'd carved into the town like initials into a tree trunk, deep, ugly, and hard to erase. Since he'd pinned the badge to his chest 3 years earlier, the gallows had seen more use than the church. Eliza bowed her head. Sir, please. My child's all I have. He's burning with fever. Dade's eyes flicked to the crowd, measuring them. You all hear that? She says she's got a child. Starving, dying. Same song we've heard a dozen times. But she still stole from honest folk. A tall rancher with a red beard spoke up. What kind of world's it become if we let thieves walk free, Sheriff? That's right, another man said. Make her pay proper. Let the others see. The sheriff nodded once, satisfied, fetched the whip. A murmur of approval stirred through the heat. Eliza felt her stomach twist. Her heart beat, so fast it blurred her vision. No, she whispered, shaking her head. Please, no. But the law here was not mercy. It was performance. The deputy stepped forward, uncoiling a leather strap from his belt. Eliza could barely breathe. Her fingers dug into the dirt. The sound of boots shifting in the dust filled her ears, and then came the unmistakable hiss of stretched leather. She thought of her son, Samuel, small, frail, lying beneath a thin quilt miles outside town. She pictured his lips cracked with thirst, his breath shallow. Her voice cracked like the earth beneath her. I just want to keep him alive. Dade raised a hand. The deputy drew back his arm. Stop. The word came from the back of the crowd, low but cutting. Heads turned. A man stepped from the shadows beside the blacksmith's shop, tall and broad-shouldered, a dust-coated hat shadowing his face. His shirt was sun-bleached, his boots worn, and his left hand carried the stillness of someone who'd known too many guns. He walked forward until he stood between Eliza and the sheriff. For a moment, no one spoke. Dade's brow furrowed. Jonas Cole, he said, the name heavy with recognition. Didn't figure you'd stick your nose in other folks' law. Jonas's voice was quiet, rough like gravel. Didn't figure law meant beating a woman in the street. She's a thief. She's hungry. The two men faced each other in the thick heat. Dade smiled without humor. You paying her debt, Cole? That the game here. Jonas reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a single silver dollar, and let it fall into the dust between them. The coin caught the sunlight, bright as defiance. That should cover the bread, the bottle, and your pride. Laughter snorted from somewhere in the crowd, uncertain, half nervous. Dade's jaw clenched. You think throwing a coin buys you the right to question me? Jonas met his eyes. No, but it buys her a chance to walk away. The sheriff's hand hovered near his revolver. The crowd held its breath. The sun beat down, merciless and still. Finally, Dade spat into the dirt. "Fine," she walks. "But don't think this makes you her savior. You just bought yourself trouble." Jonas didn't answer. He turned, offered Eliza his hand. For a heartbeat, she didn't move, too stunned to understand what mercy looked like when it finally appeared. Then she reached for him. His hand was rough, calloused, steady. He helped her stand. The crowd began to break apart, muttering. The deputy coiled his whip and followed the sheriff back into the store, the sound of spurs fading behind them. Jonas led Eliza to the side of the street, where her small wagon waited, half covered by a tarp. Beneath it lay a few meager belongings and the small body of her fevered child. The boy stirred weakly when the shadow passed over him. Jonas crouched down, studying the boy. "How long's he been like this?" "2 days," Eliza whispered. "I thought if I could get the medicine." She trailed off, staring at the ground. He nodded once, stood, and untied his horse in the hitching post. "My place is 6 miles west. There's a creek, some shade. Bring him. We'll get him through it." Eliza blinked up at him. "You don't even know us." Jonas looked toward the open land beyond town. The gold grass, the slow wind moving through it like a promise. "Don't need to." She hesitated. Pride and fear wrestled inside her. But behind her, Dry Creek was still watching, still whispering. The sheriff leaned in the doorway, arms folded, smirk carved deep. There was nothing for her here but dust and cruelty. She gathered her boy and climbed onto the wagon seat. Jonas mounted his horse and started west, his silhouette cutting through the glare. She followed, her wheels groaning over the ruts, leaving behind a town that had taken everything except her will to keep moving. The road out of Dry Creek was long and crooked, bordered by sunburnt sage and the bones of old dreams. The heat shimmered off the ground, turning the horizon into a wavering mirage. Flies buzzed around the wagon's slow wheels. For a while they traveled in silence. Jonas rode slightly ahead, his shoulders straight, his gaze fixed on the far ridges. He didn't look back. Eliza kept glancing at her boy, checking the rise and fall of his chest, whispering to him softly even when he didn't stir. She was aware of every creak of the wagon, every gust of wind that lifted the dust into her face. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Why did you help me?" Jonas didn't turn around. "Because nobody else would. You'll have the sheriff on you now. Wouldn't be the first time." She watched the way his shoulders moved with the rhythm of the horse, steady and certain. He carried a quietness that wasn't peace. It was something heavier, like regret wrapped in patience. They reached the foothills by dusk. The land softened there, dotted with cottonwoods and the faint gleam of water. Jonas guided her to a low cabin with a slanted roof and a barn missing half its door. Chickens scattered as they approached. He dismounted, led the horse to water, then came back and lifted the sleeping boy from the wagon as if he were made of glass. "Inside," he said. The cabin smelled of smoke and pine. Jonas laid the boy on a cot near the hearth. Eliza knelt beside him, smoothing his damp hair. Jonas poured water into a tin bowl and set it within reach. "Clean him up. I'll get the fire going." She did as he said, her hands trembling as she dabbed at the boy's forehead. When she looked up, Jonas was lighting the lamp. The warm glow filled the small space, chasing back the shadows. "Why are you alone out here?" she asked quietly. He poked the fire with a stick, sparks leaping. "Guess I got tired of people." "Or they got tired of you?" That earned the faintest smile. "Maybe both." The boy moaned softly. Jonas's face hardened with concern. He knelt, checked the child's pulse, then stood again. "He's strong. Fever's bad, but he's still fighting. You did right to try." Eliza shook her head. "Did right? I stole." He poured her a cup of water, handed it to her. "You tried to save your child. There's no wrong in that." She drank slowly, the coolness cutting through the dryness in her throat. For the first time in days, she felt a flicker of something like safety. Outside, night crept across the prairie. Coyotes called in the distance, their cries carrying a lonely kind of music. Jonas stepped out onto the porch, leaning against a rail, staring into the dark. Eliza followed a moment later. The stars were fierce and bright above them, scattered like silver dust. She stood beside him, arms folded against the chill. "I should thank you," she said. He shook his head. "Don't. Just rest. Sheriff Dade won't let this go easy. You'll need strength for what's coming." Her stomach tightened. "He said you bought trouble." Jonas gave a slow nod. "That's all Dry Creek's ever sold." Silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable but thick with unspoken thoughts. The wind moved softly through the grass. Eliza looked out toward the horizon. "I came west thinking it'd be better. Thought maybe out here people still have hearts." "Some do," he said. "They just hide them so the world don't take what's left." She turned to study him. The firelight from inside the cabin caught the side of his face. Strong jaw, the thin scar running from his temple to his cheek. A man marked by both violence and restraint. "Who were you before this place?" she asked. Jonas exhaled slowly. "A soldier once. Fought for a flag that forgot me soon as the war ended. Rode with men who thought killing made them right. I buried most of M myself." There was no bitterness in his tone, just fact. Eliza lowered her gaze. "And yet you still stepped forward." He met her eyes. "Maybe I got tired of watching people break." Inside, the child coughed weakly. Eliza rushed to his side, smoothing his hair again. Jonas followed, checked the fever. The boy's skin was slick with sweat, but his breathing had steadied. "He's holding on," Jonas murmured. "Keep the cloth wet. I'll check on the stock." When he stepped back out into the darkness, Eliza sat beside her son, her mind whirling. Kindness was a stranger she'd forgotten existed. And yet here it was, in a man who asked for nothing, who'd risked everything to stop a whip from falling. She glanced toward the door, where the night wind whispered through the cracks. Beyond it lay a town without mercy, ruled by men who mistook cruelty for order. But out here, on the edge of nowhere, stood one man who didn't look away. As the fire crackled low, Eliza brushed a tear from her cheek. Maybe the frontier still held something worth believing in after all. And somewhere in the dark, miles away, Sheriff Harlan Dade rode out of town with 2 deputies at his side, his eyes hard and calculating. Trouble was coming for Jonas Cole. But for the first time in a long while, Eliza Ward wasn't running anymore. She sat in the faint glow of the fire, her son breathing beside her, the rough sound of a man's boots pacing outside. Mercy had a shape tonight, and looked a lot like hope wrapped in dust and silence. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain and gun oil. Out there, beyond the hills, thunder rolled like a promise. Eliza closed her eyes, feeling the pulse of it deep inside her. The world was changing, and whether she wanted it or not, she was part of it now. Maybe Mercy didn't live in Dry Creek. Maybe it lived in one man's hand. Dawn broke pale and cold over the prairie, spreading thin light across the land until it bled into the valley. Jonas Cole stepped out of the cabin, rolling his sleeves to the elbow, and took a long look at the line of hills to the east. The storm that threatened all night had passed without rain, but the ground still smelled of it. Wet sage and dust, the scent of a land that could wash clean and turn cruel in the same breath. Behind him, through the open door, came the faint rustle of movement and a soft voice murmuring to a child. Eliza Ward was awake before him again, tending to her son. She hadn't slept much. He knew the sound of exhaustion when it hung in her room. The boy's fever had broken in the night, and though his breathing was still shallow, there was color returning to his cheeks. That small miracle brought a kind of quiet to the cabin, one Jonas wasn't used to. He gathered a pail and headed toward the barn. The path was lined with stubborn weeds and scattered hoof prints. The soil cracked in places where years of drought had bitten deep. 2 horses shifted inside, restless at the sound of footsteps. He brushed them down, worked the pump until water splashed cold and clear into the trough. Life on the frontier was a pattern of small labors that kept men sane. When he turned, Eliza stood in the doorway, her hands clasped before her, the morning light soft against her face. The lines of worry hadn't left her eyes, but something in her had steadied. She wore a faded shawl over her shoulders, and her hair, once tangled and dull with dust, caught a trace of sun as the wind stirred it. "How is he?" Jonas asked. Better, she said, her voice low. He's sleeping again. Thank you. He nodded, slipping the bridle over the mare's head. No thanks needed. You'll need to stay close for a few days. Once he's strong enough to travel, you should move on. Her fingers tightened around the edge of her shawl. Move on where? Jonas didn't answer right away. He lifted the saddle onto the mare, cinched the strap, and let the silence fill the space between them. Finally, he said, Anywhere but Dry Creek. Dade won't forget what happened. She swallowed. You think he'll come here? I don't think, he said quietly. I know. Eliza's gaze drifted to the horizon. You stood up for me, and now you'll pay for it. Already paid for worse, he replied, mounting the horse. Best thing you can do is get your boy well. I'll ride into town, see what talk there is. She caught the reins before he could turn the horse. Jonas, don't go back there. He looked down at her, his expression unreadable. A man can't run from the place he calls home. Her voice trembled. That town has no mercy. You saw what they did to me. He met her eyes, a flicker of something soft behind the roughness. I saw what one man did. Doesn't mean the rest are lost. He pulled the reins free and rode toward the open plain, his figure growing smaller until it became another shadow on the land. Eliza stood for a long time, watching the dust rise behind him. Then she turned back to the cabin, to her sleeping boy. She brushed his hair back, whispering, We'll be safe. We have to be. Jonas reached Dry Creek before noon. The town was awake but uneasy. Conversations dropped as he rode through. Men nodded stiffly, women turned away. The sound of a hammer echoed from the blacksmith's, the clang ringing like judgment. He tied his horse outside the saloon and stepped inside. Smoke hung thick in the air, and the room smelled of tobacco, whiskey, and secrets. A few card players looked up, then backed down at their hands. The barkeep, a broad man with a white beard and suspicious eyes, wiped a glass and said, You're either brave or foolish coming back, Cole. Just thirsty, Jonas said, taking a stool. The barkeep poured without another word. Jonas drank slow, scanning the room. Sheriff Dade wasn't there, but word of him was. Two ranch hands whispered near the back table, their voices carrying just enough for Jonas to catch pieces. Says Dade's rounding men up. Wants to make an example of him. The woman, too. Jonas finished his drink, set the glass down, and tossed a coin on the counter. You didn't hear this from me, the barkeep said under his breath, but Dade's riding tonight. Says law don't take kindly to outlaws playing hero. Jonas nodded once and left. Outside, the sky had turned heavy and gray. He mounted his horse and rode hard for home. By the time he returned, Eliza was hanging damp linens on the line, her face calm but distant. The boy sat near the porch, wrapped in a blanket, eyes open and watching the world like he wasn't sure it would still be there tomorrow. Jonas dismounted. He's stronger. Eliza smiled faintly. He asked if there would be breakfast. Then he'll live. But the smile faded when she saw his face. What is it? He untied the rifle from his saddle and checked the chamber. Dade's coming. Her breath caught. When? Tonight. Maybe sooner. Eliza looked toward the hills, the wide silence stretching out around them. You could still run. He shook his head. Running only delays the fight. Then what will you do? He looked around the ranch, at the sagging fence, the leaning barn, the quiet land that had carried his solitude for years. What I can. That evening, as the light faded, Jonas worked without rest. He reinforced the doors, filled the lanterns, and laid spare ammunition on the table. Eliza followed his lead, fetching water, stacking wood, helping where she could, though her hands trembled. When the work was done, they ate in silence. The boy slept again, his face peaceful. The firelight flickered against cabin walls, painting shadows that moved like ghosts. Eliza broke the quiet first. You've done this before. Jonas didn't look up. Fought men? Too many times. Why? He leaned back, eyes distant. Used to think it was about right and wrong. Later I learned it was just about who walked away breathing. She studied him, seeing beyond the calm exterior to the wear beneath it. And now, He gave a small shrug. Now it's about who's worth fighting for. The words hung in the air, soft and heavy. Eliza looked away, her throat tightening. Outside, wind swept across the plain, rattling the windows. Jonas stood, grabbed his coat, and checked the rifle again. You should rest. I'll keep watch. But sleep was impossible. Eliza lay awake listening to the faint creak of boards, the steady rhythm of his boots pacing outside. Every sound seemed sharp in the dark. The howl of distant coyotes, the rustle of grass, the crackle of dying fire. She thought of Dry Creek, of Dade's face, of the way the townspeople had looked at her. Then she thought of Jonas, standing alone in the night for no reward but conscience. When dawn came, it came slow and red. Jonas was still outside, his rifle across his lap, eyes on the horizon. She stepped out quietly, wrapped in her shawl. You didn't sleep, she said. He smiled faintly. Didn't need to. Quiet nights like this are rare. They won't stay that way. No, he agreed. They won't. By midday, clouds gathered again. The wind shifted east, carrying dust and the distant echo of hooves. Jonas heard it first. He rose, scanning the ridge. A plume of dirt climbed into the sky. Riders, maybe 10 or 12. They're coming, he said. Eliza's hands went cold. Can we hide? He shook his head. No use. But you can take the boy to the cellar. Stay quiet, no matter what happens. She grabbed his arm. Jonas. He looked at her then, really looked, and she saw the calm acceptance in his eyes. I've lived most of my life waiting for something that mattered. Don't take that from me now. Tears welled in her eyes. She nodded, unable to speak, and gathered her son. Jonas took his place by the fence, rifle steady against the post. The riders crested the ridge, Sheriff Dade in front, his badge glinting, his smile cold. Jonas Cole, he called out. Step aside and hand over the woman. I'll forget the rest. Jonas's voice carried clear across the yard. You ain't here for justice, Dade. You're here for pride. Dade laughed. You always did think you knew the difference. Guess the war taught you nothing. Jonas's eyes narrowed. It taught me enough. The first shot came from one of Dade's men, wild and high. Jonas answered, his rifle cracking like thunder. The man dropped from his horse before the echo died. Then the valley erupted. Gunfire shattered the silence. Horses screamed. Bullets tore through the dry air. Jonas moved with measured precision, reloading fast, every motion practiced. He took cover behind the trough. Fired again. Another rider fell. Inside the cellar, Eliza held her son close, whispering prayers she hadn't spoken since before her husband's death. Every shot made her flinch. Every pause felt like an eternity. Outside, the dust turned thick, the world reduced to noise and smoke. Jonas felt the sting of a bullet graze his shoulder, the warmth of blood seeping through his sleeve. He didn't stop. Then came Dade's voice again, closer now. You can't win this, Cole. Jonas ducked behind the fence post. Didn't figure to, just figured to make it cost you. The sheriff dismounted, stalking through the haze. He fired twice, splinters flying from the post. Jonas rolled aside, raised his rifle, but the chamber clicked empty. Dade grinned, stepping forward. End of the line. Before he could pull the trigger, a sharp crack split the air. Dade froze, eyes wide, then turned. Eliza stood in the cabin doorway. Shotgun braced against her shoulder, smoke curling from the barrel. Leave him, she said, voice shaking. It's done. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then one of Dade's men dropped his weapon. Another followed. Dade's sneer faltered as he saw their fear. Jonas got to his feet, blood on his sleeve, eyes hard. You came looking for mercy, he said. Now you found it. He could have killed Dade then. Instead, he lowered his rifle. Get off my land. Dade hesitated, hate burning in his stare, but he turned and climbed onto his horse. The others followed, leaving the valley in silence again. When the last rider disappeared, Jonas turned to Eliza. She was pale, trembling, the shotgun slipping from her hands. He caught her before she fell. You saved my life, he said quietly. Her lips parted, her voice barely a whisper. You saved mine first. He helped her inside, bound his wound, then sat near the fire as the boys stirred awake, asking faintly, "Mama, is it over?" Eliza brushed his hair. "Yes, baby, it's over for now." Outside, the sky began to clear. The land smelled of gunpowder and rain, a strange mix of death and renewal. Jonas looked toward the horizon, his jaw set. Trouble would return. Men like Dade didn't forget, but something had changed. For the first time in years, he wasn't fighting alone. Eliza sat beside him in the fading light, her eyes reflecting both exhaustion and something stronger, resolve. The quiet between them held a weight that felt almost holy. Beyond the hills, thunder rolled again, softer this time, like the echo of a promise. And as the last of the daylight faded, the cabin stood firm against the coming dark. Two souls inside bound by a choice neither of them could take back. Mercy in a world that had long forgotten the meaning of it. Here's Section 3, 1,700 words, of Asterisk, a woman on her knees, a town without mercy, until he stepped forward. Asterisk, the final act of your cinematic Western tale, written to deliver a powerful, emotional, and gripping conclusion. The night before the trial, the wind didn't sleep. It screamed through the gaps in the shutters, rattling them like bones in a coffin. Mary sat in the cell's corner, hands clasped, head bowed, not in prayer, but in exhaustion. The lamplight flickered against her face, tracing every hollow-line grief it carved there. Across the room, Marshal Harlan leaned against the wall, his arms folded, his eyes unreadable. "Tomorrow they'll want blood," he said quietly. Mary didn't answer. She didn't need to. The whole town had been sharpening its knives all week. The preacher's wife spat whenever she passed the jail. The men at the saloon placed bets on how long she'd scream before she broke. Mercy had left Rustwood long before Mary ever arrived. Harlan pushed away from the wall, the floorboards creaking beneath his boots. "I sent a wire to Fort Randall. Told them I'm holding a prisoner that needs a fair trial under federal law." She raised her eyes, hope flickering weakly in their depths. "And—" He hesitated. No reply. "And even if they send one, it'll come too late." The silence between them was thick, heavy as a noose that waited in the square. Outside, someone laughed, followed by the faint echo of boots and spurs. The town was already gathering its courage in whiskey and hate. Mary's voice came out soft. "You don't have to stay, Marshal. You've done enough." He gave a low chuckle, dry and bitter. "Not near enough. I've kept the peace for 15 years in this godforsaken place. And for what? So good men could turn into beasts when fear takes hold." He shook his head. "Not this time." She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe in anything again. But belief was a fragile thing in the frontier. It could break under the weight of truth. Hours crawled by, each one slower than the last. Just before dawn, Harlan left the cell and stepped outside. The air was sharp, cold enough to sting his lungs. The horizon was a thin blade of red, slicing through the black. He watched as the first light spread across the street, touching the gallows that stood waiting like a dark promise. He didn't flinch, but something in his chest shifted, a quiet resolve turning to steel. By the time the sun cleared the ridge, the whole town was awake. Men gathered in clusters, their breath visible in the cold morning air. Women stood on porches, clutching shawls, whispering names that weren't prayers. Rustwood had always been quick to judge and quicker to punish. Mary was led out by 2 deputies, boys really, barely old enough to shave. Her wrists were bound, her face pale, but her back straight. The crowd parted as she passed, and she heard the hiss of their hatred like a snake in the dust, which someone spat. "Poison her own husband," another growled. Mary kept her eyes forward. If she looked at them, if she saw their faces, she might break. Harlan followed behind, his revolver heavy at his side. He'd ordered the deputies to keep their rifles unloaded. It was a small act of defiance, but it was something. The gallows loomed at the edge of the square, rough-hewn and ugly. The rope swung slightly in the wind, whispering against the beam. Reverend Cole waited beneath it, his Bible open, his expression hard as stone. "Marshal," he said as Harlan approached, "we are gathered to see justice done." Justice. Harlan's voice was low but dangerous. Or vengeance. The Reverend's lips tightened. God's will and justice are one. Harlan's eyes narrowed. I reckon God's got better aim than most men here. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Cole's face darkened, but he said nothing. Mary was led up the steps. The boards creaked under her weight. The noose dangled before her, thick and rough. She could smell the hemp, dry and bitter. For a moment, she closed her eyes and saw her husband's face. Not the cruel sneer he wore at the end, but the man he'd once been. The man who'd held her hand under the prairie stars, before whiskey and greed hollowed him out. She whispered, "Forgive me." Then she opened her eyes again and faced the crowd. Cole raised his Bible. "Mary Carter, you stand accused of murder. Do you have any last words before this town sends your soul to judgment?" The square went silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Mary's voice was steady. "You say I killed a man. You're right. But it wasn't murder. It was survival. He would have taken everything I had. My body, my home, my life. You call it sin. I call it breathing." She looked out over the crowd. "You all know what kind of man he was. You just chose to look away." A rumble spread through people. Uneasy, restless. Truth was a hard thing to swallow in daylight. Cole raised his hand to speak, but before he could, a voice cut through the noise. "Hold!" It was Marshal Harlan. Every head turned as he climbed the gallows steps. The boards groaned under his boots, his badge glinting in the sun. "This execution's illegal," he said, his voice ringing across the square. "There's been no jury, no lawful sentence. You hang this woman, and you'll answer to the U.S. Marshal Service." A man in the crowd shouted, "Ain't no marshal but you here, Harlan." "Then I guess that makes me the law," he said, his tone sharp as a whip crack. Laughter, bitter and cold, rippled through the men. One stepped forward, a big man with a red beard and a rifle slung low. Jed Carson, foreman of the railroad crew and the loudest voice in town. "She killed a man, Harlan. Ain't no writ needed for that. She confessed right here." "She confessed to fighting back," Harlan said. "And there ain't no law against surviving." Carson spat. "You going soft, Marshal? Over a woman?" Harlan's eyes hardened. "Maybe I'm remembering what decency looks like." The tension thickened, pulsing like a storm about to break. Hands twitched toward holsters. A whisper ran through the crowd like dry grass catching fire. Then Carson's rifle lifted. The sound of the hammer cocking was sharp, final. Harlan moved before he thought. His revolver cleared leather in one smooth motion. The report cracked through the air, echoing off the buildings. Carson stumbled backward, a red bloom spreading across his chest. For a long moment, no one moved. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then the square erupted. Gunfire roared. People screamed. The air filled with smoke and chaos. Harlan pushed Mary down, the two of them rolling behind the gallows steps as bullets tore through the boards. "Stay down," he shouted. She didn't argue. He fired twice, taking down a man reloading near the saloon doors. Another tried to rush the steps. Harlan's boot met his face halfway, sending him sprawling. The smell of gunpowder mixed with dust and blood. The square was a battleground. And through it all, the Reverend shouted from the gallows, his voice rising like thunder. "Stop this madness. Stop it in the name of God." But no one listened. When the smoke began to clear, half the town lay wounded or dead. The others fled, scattering like leaves before the wind. Harlan stood in the center, chest heaving, his revolver empty, the weight of what he'd done pressing down hard. Mary rose slowly, her hands still bound. Her dress was torn, her face streaked with dirt, but her eyes burned bright. "It's over," she whispered. Harlan shook his head. "No, not yet." He turned toward the church, where Cole still stood, trembling, his Bible clutched like a weapon. "You preached about justice," Harlan said, his voice low. "Now you've seen what your kind of justice brings." Cole's lips trembled. "You've damned this town." "No," Harlan said. "It was damned long before I got here." He holstered his gun, then pulled out his knife and cut Mary's bindings. The rope fell away, her wrists raw but free. "What now?" she asked softly. He looked toward the horizon, where the rising sun burned through the smoke. Now we leave it behind. They walked out together, past the fallen men, past the gallows, past the wreck of a town that had once believed it was righteous. No one stopped them. No one dared. By the time they reached the ridge, the wind had calmed. The land stretched out before them, vast, endless, unforgiving. But for the first time, it didn't feel like a prison. They stopped at the crest. Below, the prairie rolled out in waves of gold and shadow. Mary turned to look back at Rustwood. From this distance, it was just a smudge of smoke and memory. "I don't know where I'll go," she said quietly. Harlan gave a faint smile. "Anywhere but back." She studied him, the scar beneath his eye catching the light. "You risked everything for me." "Why?" He hesitated, then said, "Maybe I was tired of watching good people die while I kept the peace." They stood in silence for a long time. Then Mary said, "You could come with me." He looked at her, really looked, at the strength in her shoulders, the defiance that had survived every lash, every lie. There was something unbroken in her, something he hadn't seen in years. "I reckon I could," he said softly. They rode out together that morning. Two souls burned clean by fire, heading into the unknown. The prairie swallowed them, the wind carrying away the last echoes of gunfire. As they disappeared into the horizon, the sun rose higher, washing the world in light. Maybe somewhere down the line, people would tell their story differently. Maybe they'd say a marshal fell for a killer, or a killer saved a marshal's soul. Maybe they'd forget their names entirely. But one thing would remain true. In a town without mercy, one man stepped forward and changed everything. And if you listen close, you can still hear the whisper that day in the wind across the plains. So what do we take from this tale? Maybe it's this. The frontier wasn't just a place, but a reckoning. A mirror that showed what a soul was made of when stripped bare. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Because sometimes mercy doesn't come from heaven. It rides it on horseback.